So hello and welcome to Multi-tenancy Working Group meeting on October the 8th. We have a pretty full agenda. I'm just going to kick it off by quickly going over our plans for Kubecon in San Diego. So I hope a bunch of you are planning on going to Kubecon. I would like to encourage you, if you're traveling for Kubecon, to attend the Contributor Summit, which is a Kubernetes Contributor Day that is the day before the conference starts. So the conference really kicks off on Tuesday, and the Contributor Summit is on that Monday. So if people would like to attend, currently you can sign up to go. If you are an active contributor, then you will automatically be added to the attendee list, and otherwise you'll be put on a wait list, but there is space. And so for everyone who's interested in attending the Contributor Summit, I would definitely encourage you to do so. We will have a multi-tenancy presentation there that's going to be more of an open conversation where we encourage all of the current contributors from the different SIGs and working groups to talk about what they want to see out of multi-tenancy in Kubernetes. We did that last year in Seattle, and it was super popular, so we're doing it again at the Contributor Summit this year. So that should be cool. In addition, if you're going to KubeCon this year, and all of these things are going to be recorded as well for people who can't attend, so don't worry if you can't make it. So the Contributor Summit, our session there, will be recorded and shared on the internet for people who want to watch it. And then we also are going to have an introduction to multi-tenancy and a deep dive to multi-tenancy at KubeCon itself. The introduction is normally aimed at, so a lot of KubeCon attendees are not contributors to Kubernetes. It's a very large conference. I think they're expecting like 12,000 people this year. So it's mostly users of Kubernetes. And so the intro is really explaining to people, how does a working group work? What are our current initiatives? How can I get started? So it's a very like 101 sort of experience. And then a deep dive that's going to be led by Sanjeev is going to go over in more depth the various projects that we're working on, and he's going to work with some of the contributors on putting together that presentation and presenting. We're also going to have a panel, and the panel will have, I think, 5 or 6 people on it, just discussing multi-tenancy at their different organizations, how they see it evolving, and so that should be cool. So we got a lot of stuff going on. Definitely encourage everyone to come to KubeCon if you can. Definitely check out the Contributor Summit. And if you have been sort of checking out the multi-tenancy working group, but don't consider yourself a Kubernetes contributor yet, there are 2 workshops at the Contributor Summit for new contributors. There's a 101 and a 201 level class. So if you really want sort of the maintainers of Kubernetes to take you on a code walkthrough of the different pieces of Kubernetes and encourage you in how you can get started as a contributor to the Kubernetes project, those are great things to sign up for. So yeah, I think that's everything that we're planning on doing. There is also going to be sort of a SIG meet and greet where we'll have a table and we'll talk to people about multi-tenancy and do some other activities. So it should be a lot of good stuff, and definitely ping me if you have any questions. Cool. So that's it for our KubeCon agenda, and now on to our meeting notes agenda. So we have Raffaele, who was going to go over namespace configuration operator. It looks like you're on. Would you like to kick off?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so my name is Raffaele Spazzoli, and I work for Red Hat as an architect for OpenShift deployments. And let me turn on the video. The namespace configuration operator is an operator that I developed to support the use case of development teams onboarding on the cluster. Okay, so let's talk about more in general about this use case, and then I will explain how the operator can help support it. So what we see is that very often these large deployments of OpenShift cluster, but it's going to be the same for Kubernetes. There is a team that manages the platform, and then there are several development teams that want to be onboarded. So we try to create automated process to onboard the team, which means technically it means to create the needed namespaces to support the application SDLC. It means give permissions, airbag permissions to these namespaces. It means create quotas. Sometimes it can mean create default network policy configurations and so on, depending from the customer needs. So in general, we don't see, I haven't found much in the upstream community to support this use case. So generally the customers end up using something like ServiceNow or the like to create these processes, because it's a workflow that has to go through approvals. And ideally, in the end, it's all automated and self-service, right? But one thing, so I think in, long term, this process could be self-hosted on a cluster if somebody wanted to take the time to develop such an application. But in general, in the end, we need a way to make sure that whatever the configuration was that was created for these namespaces that we have created for the teams, they stay in place, right? There is no drift between the creation time and the rest of the lifetime of those namespaces. And that's where the operator comes into play, because this operator takes a configuration that needs to be applied, and it takes a namespace selector, and then what it does is to apply that configuration to all the selected namespace. And the configuration can be anything, any namespace object. It's up to you to decide what it is. Questions so far? I'm going to share the screen and show a couple of examples, but that's in a nutshell, that is what the operator does. Okay, so let me see if I can.
So I've got one question. This is, hi, I'm Adrian Ludwin. I work at Google, and I've been working on the hierarchical namespace controller, which covers some of the same grounds. I've been looking into your controller as well, or operator, I should say. Do users ever have the ability to make any changes to the objects in their namespace, or will the NCC overwrite any changes that they make?
So as the code is now, what you can see, the operator will just will react to you changing the definition of what you need to be, what your configuration needs to be. But if you have the permission to change the actual created object in one of those namespaces, the operator will not react to that. Okay. But
so if you change something in the namespace, it will not react.
It will not react.
But if
I've just found. So expect a PR. It's gonna get that feature also.
Okay, so you intend to do that. I don't care.
Yeah. I intend to do that. Yeah, I think a good operator should be able to do that, right? It was difficult to find a way to create a controller on an unknown type, right? Because you don't know what the user is going to ask you for. But yes,
you had a limited number of types that you supported?
No, it's absolutely generic.
Oh, it's generic. Okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely generic, including CRD. It doesn't make a difference.
Has that changed in the past year? I think I read the original blog post, and there were like 6 or 7 types that were enumerated.
Yes, it changed.
Okay, yes. Got it. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so it's generic. Like I said, it can be anything that is a namespace type, and the controller will make sure that those namespaces get this configuration, and then this upcoming feature will make sure that if you, by mistake or maliciously, you change the configuration, it gets immediately reset to what it should be.
And where are the original objects stored? Are they stored in like a super CRD that has like a big bunch of things, or they're stored in a namespace as objects?
So it's a CRD. Yeah, it's a CRD that you can put anywhere you want.
And it basically stores like a bunch of unstructured JSON.
Correct. It's just an array of unstructured, and
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, I think that's all my questions for now. So I'll stop. stop interrupting.
All right. Good questions. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. For example, I hope you can see this. I'm not sure if there's a way to make it larger. Yeah. So for example, this one is a way to assign quotas to namespaces, right? I have two examples. So I call this CRD that that enforces a configuration namespace config. And as you can see here, we have the namespace selector. So it will select all the namespaces that have a given label. And then what it does is create a quota object, a resource quota object. This is an array, but in this example, I only have one object. And so this was an example to show you can have two sizes, for example, a small size and large size of projects. And depending on how you configure your onboarding process, when you create the namespaces, you can assign those labels and they will automatically get a quota. Make sense?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I have other examples, but they're all on the same, you know, they're all same concept. This, for example, is a way to set up some network policies. If you're familiar with OpenShift, before network policies were introduced, there was some default network rules inside the SDN, and this example sets up the same rules, but in network policy terms. So it was going to be a simple way for customers to migrate from the old way to the network policy way. And again, there is a selector with the multi-tenant label, and then two network policy to set up the same type of rules.
So I assume that in deployments of this, the people who have access to the namespace itself, who can modify the namespace, has to be trusted, because it's based on the label on the namespace, and so you can change the policies that you get simply by changing the labels that you've applied on your namespace. That's correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and usually, yeah, when we try to create these onboarding processes, the developers don't get enough permissions to change their namespace or create a new namespaces.
So this is that's an operation that's reserved for the central platform team?
Right. Or this automation, right? It could be, if it's an automation in ServiceNow, but equivalent. Yeah, it's equivalent concept. It's a highly privileged operation. Yeah, to create a new namespace.
Raffaele, so in the context of OpenShift, your default projects already have a namespace config, right? So this would be wouldn't the project creation request similarly have default namespace integration?
It's different. It's different. Yeah, it's true that in OpenShift, when you create a project, that's basically a template for a set of objects that need to be created in the namespace. But those exist only, you know, those are enforced only at creation time, and then there is nothing to really enforce that they have to remain what they are, what was requested. This operator will enforce consistency at at runtime.
Okay.
That's the difference. The other problem with that mechanism in OpenShift is you can only have one template. That it's the same for all the projects that you ever create. With this, because you can assign multiple labels to multiple projects, you can actually have a variety of flavor of namespaces or configurations of namespaces.
Okay. Another thing is that these resources, the resource names, you're just going to assume that there are no name conflicts, right, with the resource names.
Yeah, that's an assumption. Yes.
Yeah,
Actually,
but
they're going to be overwritten because this is going to be enforced.
So if somebody already has a allow from namespace, you will overwrite that.
Yeah. And the idea here is the label are assigned at project namespace creation. So these are the first objects that are created anyway. However, you are pointing out a possible, concern.
So how do we specify the default deny policy, right, which will be needed in the global in general?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. The default DNI policy?
Yeah, I mean the default
Okay.
deny policy, so that by default there will not be any traffic which is allowed, right?
For this particular network policy example?
Yeah.
You mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, if you need it, you can add it here. But these are just examples. I don't claim that they make sense for your particular use case, but it's an example of how you can use this operator.
yeah, I had a sort of a general question that covers quite a few of the previous ones, which is how, in general, do you handle errors? So it sounds like, somebody creates this CRD and it says, propagate this config to all these namespaces. But then for whatever reason, either if the config is not valid or maybe it was at some point, but then later the clusters or something gets updated and that config is no longer valid, or there's insufficient quota or whatever may cause an error. How does that error get dealt with and propagated back to whoever's making the configuration?
Right now, I believe I just raise an event of a warning event for any kind of error that I get.
Okay, and it sounds like at the moment you only ever actually attempt that operation once. So you don't, you mentioned there's an update which now goes and diffs, looks what's in the cluster and sees if it's correct, and if not, corrects it. But previously it sounds like you only ever tried that thing once. And if that error happened, then is it correct that there's no reattempt to apply the config?
No, it will reattempt. It will reattempt with a quadratic, pause between attempts. So every time it's
okay, makes sense.
It's gonna double,
yeah. But once it's succeeded once, it assumes that it's good, and then it leaves it like that. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Raffaele, I have one more query. So I see that it's possible to have network policy assigned for each namespace, right, using this namespace config operator.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I want to, extend it further and, use something like IP pools per namespace, is that possible? And how can that be done, if you have any idea?
What do you mean by IP pools?
Like, a specific subnet of IP per namespace.
Is that a configuration supported in a network policy?
No, I don't think it's supported in network policy though.
Yeah, basically the requirement for this operator is whatever configuration you need has to be it has to be possible to express it in a resource, in a namespace resource. You cannot use a cluster level resource. It has to be a namespace resource.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if what you're asking can be expressed that way. But if it can, it doesn't matter which resource it is. Just copy and paste it in this type of CR, and it will be enforced.
Raffaele, one other thing is the individual resources they are all versioned, right? Now, have you given any thought to what happens when those individual resource versions are also changing upstream, like network policy? You've got networking.kits.io/v1. Um, what would be the workflow to kind of um, move this to the same API v2, or is that sort of left to the administrator as to kind of how to manage that? Because you're kind of creating this operator at a time when you decided that these are the versions of resources, but these versions.
I don't, this for me is just input data. You can change it anytime. My operator is not dependent on on a specific version of resources.
Right. I guess
it's completely dynamic. So if one day we have network policy v2, you have to upgrade them. Choose whatever method you decide to upgrade them. But if you can just rewrite this to be v2, the operator will overwrite whatever you have, and it should be fine.
Yeah.
Well, it will clean up. It will clean up orphan objects.
How does it know what's an orphaned object?
Sorry?
How does it know what the orphaned object is? It's got some annotation on them or label?
Labels, yeah.
Labels, okay.
You will add a label, yeah. So, for example, if you know what I mean, if you are deploying this namespace config, and then you decided you didn't need this one, so you override this namespace config and deleting this object. Now you have maybe 30 namespaces that have this object. The operator will detect that and will delete those objects.
Right.
Okay, but you would not, you do not have any explicit upgrade procedure. You're just bringing everything to the state of the latest manifest.
Yeah.
How will it detect that this is not coming from previous one? How will it detect?
Well, every object that is created gets a label that uniquely identify this namespace config as the owner of that object. Okay. I cannot really use the owner annotation because they will exist in different namespaces, and the owner works only if you are in the same namespace. But there is a similar concept. So then I scan for all the objects with that label, and if they're not in the manifest, it means they need to be deleted.
So what if there are RBAC rules preventing one of these resources getting created in that namespace?
Yeah, I haven't. I basically assume that this operator is going to be run as a cluster admin.
Yeah.
You can scale it down. You can give it a service account with fewer permission or less permissions, but then you can incur in problems where you don't have permission to create, delete, or list those resources. And so that's something that is up to you if you want to fine-tune the security around it. But my assumption is it's going to run as cluster admin.
How many people or customers or users do you know that are using this today, and what kind of deployments?
So interestingly, none of my customers, but I have colleagues that have customers that are using it, and exactly in the context that I was explaining, they need ways to enforce configurations that have been decided at namespace provisioning time. And I was talking to a colleague of mine just yesterday. He's using it mainly for network policies at this point, and I think he's considering resource quotas.
And do you have any idea of the rough number of people who are using it?
No, but I don't think it's very high.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll ask the obvious question, I think. Have you had a look at the hierarchical namespace controller? Because it treads some of the same ground, except it's based on a hierarchy instead of labels. And of course, anything that you can do with hierarchy, you can do with labels. And so you could certainly implement any kind of hierarchical structure you liked using the namespace configurator. And so a hierarchical model is more restrictive, which in some cases is good and in some cases is bad. Other than that, it seems like we've got a fairly similar usage model. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on those.
Can you, no, I haven't seen that article. Can you share it somehow? I'm curious.
Oh, it's on the repo. And at our last meeting, I think I gave a demo, which was recorded on YouTube. And so basically it is, you can think of it as not actually an annotation on the namespace, but you can think of it as though it is, where each namespace can point to its parent, and certain objects get copied down, like RBAC network policy, et cetera. And so it's a more rigid way that will use some of the same use cases. So there's overlap between the two, but neither is a subset of the other. So if you go, what's your email address? I can send you the links in case you're.
Okay, let me share my email address. I'll do that. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
So I can find it. Okay.
Yeah, if you look at.
I was looking at the agenda. I see the topic, but I don't see the link.
Yeah, okay, I'll just add it to the chat as well. Yeah, so if you just check that out, you can see that's got the design docs, the code, a link to the video, everything you could want to see, a script, like a demo script.
Okay.
Yeah, I looked into do you have an acronym that you use? Is it NCC? Namespace Configurator?
Oh, no, I don't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so yeah.
I think now we renamed it to namespace operator, but
namespace, yeah, the NO.
Namespace configuration operator, yeah.
NCO, okay. Yeah, if you want to have a look, they do cover some of the same ground, but yeah, as I said, slightly different user models. Yeah, I don't know which one. I don't think that one is better necessarily. It would be nice if we could figure out some way for them to. I mean, on one hand, they will work cleanly together. If you, for example, have a tree of namespaces and you put a label on the root namespace, the NCO will copy stuff into it, and then it will get distributed through the tree. So they should work together, I think, even today, if you just happen to include both of them. I'm not sure what the best practices would be around that, though.
Right.
Okay. I think the last question I have is, do you have, of the people that you know who are using it, what are their thoughts about GitOps? Are they not using it? Do they check the configuration into GitOps, but then not the list of namespaces? How does it work for them?
Yeah, we are starting to look into GitOps, and we will definitely do it more. I don't know exactly how the two will work together. Of course, you could put your namespace configuration resources into GitOps, into Git, and have GitOps manage it. So that's certainly an option. Or you can just have your Git repo have all the configuration you need for your namespaces, right, and manage everything with GitOps. We need to see a few customers doing the two things together. Which one is better? I don't know at this point.
Okay, that's great. I think once again I'm out of questions.
Raffaele, does Red Hat have a position on this? Because we've seen a few similar initiatives out of Red Hat. One is, of course, projects. And as I said, as you've mentioned earlier, projects do not have a operator model. They just have an initial template namespace templating model.
Yeah.
We've also briefly heard about operator groupings. Is this essentially your personal initiative, or does it have Red Hat blessings?
It doesn't have Red Hat blessing. It's a little bit more than my initiative. I'm the one who wrote the code, but it's now part of the what we call the community of practice, which is an internal organization of all the consultants. So when something is accepted there, it means that we kind of agree to try to adopt it in our engagements. If the customer is willing to have something that is not officially supported. So it has some agreement among us consultants that that's a good way to do it, but certainly not the official, product-wise position from Red Hat. Make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, do most customers kind of build their own namespace config automation? Seems like.
Hey, we have. So it's always. It's we say to the customer, you have to automate onboarding. Some of them do it. Some of them do it only to a certain extent. Most of them do it to a place where it's automated, but enforcing the configuration at runtime is something that it's not many of them are doing it. And for something like that, you need an operator, right?
Last question.
So it's a matter of maturity, I think.
Yeah, sorry, let me just get in last because I think we've got other talks on the agenda. The only reason you need to dynamically enforce it is because you are allowing the project user to also change those very same resources. But if your RBAC was set up such that network policy can only be ever changed by the cluster admin, then templating is fine because nobody other than the cluster admin would change it, and you don't need dynamic reconciliation. You need reconciliation only because the namespace user can themselves change these objects, right?
There is another use case when it's useful. So, for example, let's say we have created that small quota configuration, right? If you have 100 projects provisioned with that small quota configuration, and then you realize that you now want to give them a little bit more quota, you have to go and change 100 projects. But if you have an operator, you just change the definition of what small quota is, and everything is reapplied automatically. Yeah. So, a few of us think that this is a better way, more Kubernetes oriented way of managing namespaces configuration.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Are there any more questions?
Cool. Well, thank you so much. This was really interesting, and I took a couple notes. But if you have any slides or links you'd like to add to the agenda, feel free to drop them in.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe we can chat offline as well. Have a look at and compare the two controllers and see what use cases they are better or worse at, respectively.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Cool. Okay, we'll be in touch.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Thanks.
Cool. So next up is Angel and Pau on hosted namespace as a service.
Yes. Let me share the screen. Yeah. Pau?
Yeah. I think you got the wrong screen.
Yeah, sure. It's okay. Let me see. It's this one. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, hello everybody. Thank you for giving us some time to be here in the multi-tenant working group. My name is Pau, and my colleague is Ángel Fernández, with whom I started KHPin a few months ago. we are implementing a multi-tenant Kubernetes solution similar to what Rafa just said. We are creating some namespaces with resources in these namespaces in order to have the users kind of placed inside a single namespace. And we are using the vanilla Kubernetes objects. And using this, the objects, next screen. Yeah, we found different problems, mainly about logging and metrics. Then we had to think about how to extend authorization. Then there's another problem, how to do traffic routing to the different namespaces. And finally, traffic encryption, that is something that we have not solved yet. And we're going to see in all of them which problems have we found and how did we try to fix them.
Yeah. Let me talk about a little bit about logging, the logging problem in the multi-tenant scenario. As you know, almost of us, we try and we deploy Kubernetes cluster with a ELK cluster or the ELK stack. I mean, Elasticsearch for storing the log and Kibana to discover the logs and query for it. And some log recollector like Logstash and the Unfluented. But as we are offering a Kubernetes namespace as a service solution, we have to figure out how to provide logs to our customers. The first thing that came into our mind is to provide an Elasticsearch endpoint to our customers, but how we can secure that any user writes in its own index and how we provide credentials to our users to query in the Kibana dashboard. So we found that the XPack Kibana plugins was included in the Gold subscription, which is a paid subscription, until 6.8 and 7.1 versions. So an option or an alternative to make it possible is to provide an entire ELK stack to any user. But how does it scale? I mean, are you going to create an Elasticsearch cluster per tenant or per user or per namespace? So it's quite complex, and we thought that is quite overkill to provide this stack. So we found in the Kubecon Europe in Barcelona this year, a Grafana Loki solution that was designed by default to make it possible to run Grafana Loki in multi-tenant way. But it's a project that is not in a stable release. It's almost in beta or alpha status. And there is not a lot of information about how to make possible this multi-tenant configuration in Grafana Loki. We find more information. We found more information in GitHub issues in the Grafana Loki repository than in the site, the documentation, official documentation. So it was difficult to think about how to configure it in Kubernetes in a hard multi-tenant way. So this is just a very simple diagram with architectural diagram where you can find in the right more like a platform namespace which have a Grafana server, a Grafana Loki server, and a Loki multi-tenant proxy, which is a piece that we developed to make it easier to deploy Grafana Loki in a multi-tenant way, a secure multi-tenant way, hard multi-tenant. And a multi-tenant controller, just it could be the controller from Red Hat or the one developed in this working group. It has to inject in the tenants that has the logging capabilities enabled. The credentials to push logs to the local multi-tenant proxy. And this validates the basic auth and proxy the request to the Grafana Loki server. Just to know, all the requests has to be passed through the Loki multi-tenant proxy, because this is the one involved in injecting the HTTP headers to the Grafana Loki server that makes it possible to configure the Loki server in a multi-tenant way. So that's the key. I mean, Grafana Loki server documentation exposed that you have to inject some headers, but how do you do it in a secure way? I mean, how do you prevent to tenant A use the header from tenant A instead of tenant C? So we implement a basic proxy, a basic Golang proxy that adds the basic auth layer that is not available in the Grafana Loki server. And once validated, the requests are forwarded to the Grafana Loki server with the HTTP header identifying the tenant. So we create this repository here in GitHub. It's open source, and it's explained how to make it work and how to create the users and how to assign a user to a tenant. It's almost there. Also, we make a POC to validate the solution, and it's fully documented here. So give it a try. It's quite interesting to see how Grafana Loki works in a multi-tenant way. So that's all. Interesting point is that we deploy a prompt log recollector as a sidecar because of our clients' pods runs inside a gvisor, inside a gvisor node. And gvisor doesn't have the capability to mount host volumes into the pods, so we cannot have a daemon set, a prompt daemon set that mounts the -log host volume into the pod and query or request to the Loki multi-tenant proxy from a daemon set. About Kubernetes metrics is really quite similar to the logging stack. I mean, Prometheus wasn't created to support multi-tenant out of the box, so there appears solution, open source solution from Rancher and from other guys in GitHub, and it's quite similar like the proxy we developed to allow multi-tenant in Grafana Loki. It just injects some headers or some attributes in the body of the request of the Prometheus, both sides in the pushing metrics and the query for metrics. To deploy in our platform because we are small by today and provides more capability than we need by the moment. So the Prometheus multi-tenant architecture, multi-tenant architecture would like something similar to the previous diagram. Sorry. So the multi-tenant controller now has to inject a label and unique tenant identifier label to every object in a tenant. So Grafana queries to the Prometheus auth proxy. It doesn't matter if it's provided by Rancher or the other one. And this one just queried the Prometheus server with the unique identifier set by the multi-tenant controller. And it's almost the same solution. you can see it is quite simpler than logging, but it's almost the same.
Yeah, and then we go to extending the authorization. As you already know, RBAC is not enough to have a multi-tenant solution working, because there are some cases where you will need to extend the authorization layer in order to introduce some custom policies. Like, for example, you have seen now that all the deployments and pods have to have a label. So in this case, the Kubernetes allows us to extend this authorization layer through mutating webhooks or validating webhooks. This way you can absolutely do whatever you want with the objects that are being sent to the cluster. So you can change and then you can validate. And also there's a new feature in Kubernetes 1.16 that allows a single object to be passed multiple times through a mutating webhook. So one policy could add a sidecar, and then another policy could modify this sidecar. And this is something that was not possible until now. So this is really, really great. And basically the technology to do this nowadays, like the standard way, is doing with OPA, Open Policy Agent, which allows you to receive a JSON request, and then you can define a set of policies with Rigo. And also you can query the data that is inside the cluster. And basically it is going to return an answer, yes or no, if this resource can be created or has to be modified. On this side, we have created a repo that is, if you have tried Rigo, it's quite a difficult tool to understand and develop. This is a testing environment where we have been doing a unit testing environment. And then you will be able to find here some documentation on the kind of files that are present in the repo, that you will be able to find the policies. Then we have the test definitions. And then there's also going to be the mocks that are like the data that is already present in your cluster. For example, you can see here like the policy that will not allow an ingress with the same domain to be defined again.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question here?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is Adrian at Google, and I second Rego being a fun language to learn. I went through that earlier this summer myself. You introduced this as you were extending RBAC, but is it accurate to say it doesn't look like you're really trying to do necessarily user-based authorization? It sounds like it's more like you're imposing additional legality rules to make objects play nicer in a multi-tenant environment, but it's not necessarily about RBAC itself, like users and permissions and verbs. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I would say half and half, because this is one example, but then, for example, we also are, we have a layer where we authorize the domain of the ingress that you can create. So
based
in that
on the
case,
user making the request?
Exactly.
Okay, okay, thanks.
So it would be a mix between extending authorization and applying policies, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, can you repeat that ingress example?
Yeah. So in our case, for example, we are assigning a single domain to each user, and we do not allow one user to create an ingress with a domain that is not the one that he has assigned.
Right, but that's anyway not what RBAC would target, right? So going back to Adrian's question, which part of your use of OPA is RBAC extension, meaning something that would normally be done with subjects and verbs? I mean, restricting the URL of an ingress was never in the scope of ingress, was never in the scope of RBAC anyway.
And you can do it based on the namespace it's going into as well. I think you would really want to be seeing something. Maybe it's probably a question that doesn't matter too much. I was just curious about whether you were, I think it's an input dot request. There's something about the user and the group and stuff like that. I would imagine you don't need that information very much because you're more interested in the tenant than the user, unless you have some kind of concept of tenant admins. Do you have a concept like that?
No, not right now.
Okay.
Right now, you can, for us, we have even a more limited scope than that it's being developed by in your controller, in which one namespace is one tenant.
Right.
So
So
even
you
if a
can
user
always,
has two namespaces, it's like two completely different tenants.
of course. Okay. Okay, thanks.
No problem. Yeah, and then also this was presented here before. This is Kyverno, and this is something that we found really useful. And although you don't have to learn Rego, so this is the good part of it. You can express it directly with Kubernetes objects. Although we don't know if the logic that we want to apply will be able to be expressed with these custom resource definitions, but we will take a look if it's possible to do it with this tool.
Hey, Pav, this is Jim from Nirmata. I'm with the Kyverno project too, so feel free to reach out if you have any use cases which you find don't work today, and we can help you out with that.
Thanks.
Perfect. Okay, about traffic routing. When we created the Kidscreen project, we tried to find English controller that was designed by its core by multi-tenant in a multi-tenant way. We found Contour, which is, if I don't remember well, it's from the VMware guys, or I think so. And it exposes a set of CRDs. Initially, the CRD was Ingress root, and now its name is HTTP proxy. HTTP proxy allows you to define a root domain or a root HTTP proxy and delegates some HTTP proxy to be implemented in another namespace, for example. So this makes sense for our use case. But as posed before, we want to provide a pure Kubernetes experience. So we don't like to use any other CRDs, any other objects that are not part of the Kubernetes AV server by default. So we thought in deploy any ingress controller like Nginx or HCI proxy or traffic one, but always with the help of OPA. And we know that this could be weak. I mean, one, as you know, you can break your ingress controller with a bad ingress resource definition. This can be caused by a tenant A user that intentionally or not create a bad ingress definition and breaks the ingress controller or overwrites an ingress from other user or other tenants. So OPA help us to define some rules to make it more robust. And also we thought about the possibility to deploy an ingress controller per tenant, but we thought that is overpriced. I mean, you can assign a node port per tenant, and with an external load balancer point to that node port per tenant and so on. Or you can deploy a load balancer per ingress controller, but it's going to be very expensive for us. So we opt to deploy just a single ingress controller for the cluster, and and secure it and make it robust using OPA. And this is just the example that I was explaining about before. This prevents to create duplicated ingress with the same host. Explaining before, I said. So traffic encryption.
Yeah, so then we were thinking about another problem is about trying to encrypt communication from pod to pod. And this is not something easily done today. And when you think about that, you start thinking about Istio. Although before even start looking at it, it's going to be overkill because there's no official support for multi-tenant. So they basically say that you can install one control plane per tenant, which again, this doesn't scale really well for our use case, where most of our tenants just have 2, 3, maybe 5 pods. It's going to be bigger than what they really use. Then there's another problem about security. To install Istio, it's going to require root permissions and also netadmin, which we decided really early that this is not something that we are going to allow to do to our tenants. So Istio is out of the way. Then we also took a look at Linkerd, which again, it doesn't have official support. It says that the solution is to install one control plane per tenant. Too much overhead for like small tenants or clusters. Although in the latest version, when they announced the version 2.2, they were already improving the security part in the sense that you will not have to allow netadmin to the tenant spot, as this is going to be resolved using a CNI plugin that is going to modify the IP tables before even the pods are being started. Then we kind of got the conclusion that node-to-node communication encryption is going to be almost impossible to provide transparently. And we were starting to think about node-to-node encryption. Then MICE, it's another service mesh appeared, but it's kind of special because it's not using sidecar injection. It's going to be deployed as a daemon set. So it's all the traffic from pod to pod could be routed through this daemon set, or then also from node to node has to pass through this daemon set in a mandatory way. And the other thing that MICE is introducing is that it allows to use the SMI, that is the service mesh interface, which is really nice for traffic management without the overhead of sidecar injection. But once you start thinking about encrypting from node to node, this is something that can be also achieved without talking about a service mesh. It can already be thought about when you select the CNI. For example, Project Calico and Wildwater Warhol, these two projects have encryption enabled by default, but sometimes if you are in a managed Kubernetes like GCP, you might not be able to change the CNI, or it's not going to be available. So this is still some part that we have to work on and see if we can provide anything on the traffic encryption side. And this is going to be all for us. I hope you have many questions, and if you have solved any of these problems, please let us know, and we're going to be happy to contribute and answer any question that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, good stuff. You guys are doing some pretty interesting, innovative work.
Thank you, Sanjit. Okay.
I'm sure there are many questions, but because we are kind of at the end of the hour, I guess people are holding back, but probably people might contact you offline later or on the Slack channel.
Perfect.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for going over that with us. We're a little over time, so I think we're going to take a stop. And a quick reminder that if anyone has anything they'd like to present in 2 weeks, please do add that to the agenda or email the mailing list with your proposed topic. Thanks, everybody. Chat soon.